Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the 2025 Luxton Lecture. I'd just like to acknowledge the fact that we're meeting tonight on Kaurna land, but a number of people are going to make a more relevant welcome to country and acknowledgement, and I fully support their work. It's been a wonderful few years since the Luxton Lecture was first introduced, and Gus Nathan will talk to us about that at length. I think Sam inspired Gus enormously when he was his student, and it's a really worthy legacy for Professor Luxton to have this wonderful series. And Gus has really been the motivator and the motivative force behind it. I should tell you that my name is Susan Jeames, and I'm here, I think, because I chair the Heavy Industry Low Carbon Transition Cooperative Research Centre, which was spun out of the University of Adelaide. It was its founding member, and I've had a long involvement with the CET, and it was through that involvement that I got involved with we call it the HILT CRC because it's a little bit easier to say. So it's my pleasure now to introduce Professor David Lewis. Professor Lewis is a chemical engineer. He's the Executive Dean of the Faculty of Science and Engineering and Technology here. His research focuses on low-carbon solutions to the water and energy environment nexus, so he's very well qualified to talk to us, even if it's only briefly tonight. David.
Thank you, Susan. Good afternoon, everyone. So firstly, importantly, I'd like to acknowledge and pay respects to the Kaurna people, the traditional custodians whose ancestral lands we gather on. We acknowledge the deep feelings of attachment and relationship of the Kaurna people to country, and we respect and value their past, present and ongoing connections to the land and cultural beliefs. Thank you. I would also like to acknowledge our invited speaker, Alison Reeve, the Energy and Climate Change Program Director from the Grattan Institute, Susan Jeames from the HILT CRC, and our panellists, Professor Melissa Nursey-Bray, Professor Peter Draper, Professor Gus Nathan, the Interim Director of CET, CET, I'm CET, CET, too many acronyms in this university, Professor Greg Mether, and the CET Advisory Board and Management Committees and all attendees. It is a pleasure to join you today to speak about the University of Adelaide's commitment to sustainability, energy and resources through the work of our Institute for Sustainability, Energy and Resources, or ISER. The mission of ISER is clear and compelling: to build a better future and to advance towards net zero, anchored here in South Australia. We pursue this mission through globally impactful, large-scale, transdisciplinary and collaborative research. Among the centres supported by ISER, we have the Centre for Energy Technology, or CET, which stands out as a flagship. CET brings together a truly multidisciplinary team across the energy technology sector, with more than 25 academic staff, 13 research associates and over 60 PhD students. The Centre spans engineering, the sciences and the professions. This critical mass of expertise enables CET to address some of the world's most pressing challenges with both breadth and depth. CET is not only about academic excellence, it's about meaningful partnerships. The Centre is guided by an advisory board of industry experts who meet 3 times a year to ensure our research remains relevant and responsive to real-world needs. This close connection to industry has been vital in shaping CET's strong record of impact. Each year, the Centre produces more than 100 journal papers, files around 2 patents, on average, and continues to translate its research into practice, with 3 platforms already in ongoing commercial use. Equally important, CET plays a leading role in convening dialogue at both national and international levels. The Centre hosts 3 international and 1 national forum, Among them, the Hydrogen Production Technologies Forum, the High Temperature Minerals Processing Forum, and the HILT CRC Forum. In addition, the CET Annual Research Day provides a moment to celebrate achievements, share successes, and inspire the next wave of ideas. At the University of Adelaide, we are very proud of CET's contribution to accelerating the net zero transition. But we also know that, that there is not a challenge we can meet alone. We actually welcome opportunities to explore new ideas and partnerships with researchers, industry and stakeholders, both nationally and internationally. Together, by leveraging our strengths and combining our knowledge, we can create solutions that are not only technically robust, but also economically viable and, importantly, socially responsible. In closing, ISER and CET embody the University of Adelaide's, and indeed Adelaide University's, commitment to shaping a more sustainable world. Through collaboration, innovation and impact, we're hoping to chart the course towards net zero and building a better future for generations to come. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, David, for that introduction and for the overview of all the wonderful things that are done here at the University of Adelaide, soon to be Adelaide University, and welcome to the University of South Australia people who are here tonight as well. We look forward to even greater things, and I really think it's very important that you've highlighted the interdisciplinary approach that universities are taking through the centre and other institutes to solving problems that can't be solved alone. It's my pleasure now to introduce to you Professor Gus Nathan. I could read you his CV. It's about 2 pages long. It's full of wonderful awards and acclamations. Gus is a wonderful character to work with because he's so encouraging. I always know when he's managing me because he says, "Oh, that's a good point, Susan." And he doesn't say "but" then, it's just a comma. And it makes it very easy to work with Gus because he really does try and pull the best out of people. So apart from being a mechanical engineer, the research director at HILT, he's also the acting director at ISER, which is a very important and hard-working role here at the university. So Gus is going to give us an overview of the Sam Luxton history and why it was important for him to establish this series of lectures. Over to you, Gus.
Thank you very much, Susan, for your generous words, and also thank you, David, for the great introduction. Thank you all for being here. Also, I'd like to add my acknowledgement to the advisory board, who played a really central role throughout this process, and many of them are sitting around the place. It is really a great honour and pleasure to be able to talk about Sam Luxton, who was my academic father, and I had a great privilege to be able to work with him and be mentored and learn a lot from him, and say a few words about him. But I'd also like to acknowledge the other members of the CET leadership team shown here, 2 of which are listed here also from University of South Australia, which is Matt and Tim, who, because we've already started working together, and acknowledge Greg in particular, who's taken on this leadership role through this transition period, because we're already starting to work together. So I'll try to highlight some of those. But this is Professor R.E. So where does Sam come from? Well, I guess that's why he dubbed me Gus, and that's why the name has also stuck with me, because it's also not my first name, but it's a name that goes back to his cricket days. A bit more about him, shown here. He was, as you can see, born in Queensland and went to Geelong Grammar. Then he came to the University of Adelaide to do his undergraduate degree, went to the UK, Queen Mary College, for his PhD, and of course at that time that's where the leading education really was. He came to the University of Sydney to take up a lecturer role and moved up to associate professor, and then came to Adelaide to take up the chair, and remained in that role till he retired. But during the period, he became he became the Dean of Faculty and did a lot of other things here. I guess we could go through all of his, but it would take a long time, but a few key points, as you can see from this list. He did publish in Nature, and one of the interesting things, he did the story about why does a water tumble down the bathtub in one direction in the northern hemisphere and the other direction in the southern hemisphere, which is Coriolis force. And the group there actually demonstrated that it wasn't just a myth, but it does happen, published in Nature. But he also, and built on from the beginning, while he was in the UK, he started working with a lot of industry and built a really strong industry linkages, and that was really what led him to forge a link between fundamental research that was targeted at industrial challenges. And through that, he also had a lot of work in understanding policy. He became a fellow of ATSI and worked a lot in that process, including leading to NERDIC, which eventually became a founder of ARENA. He was the lead author of that document. So he established a lot of interdisciplinary work at the University of Adelaide, and that is really that legacy of working with industry, identifying industry challenges, and then assembling research programs to lead to that is really what his legacy is about. So really, two of the key platforms that came out of his legacy that are ongoing commercial platforms, one of them was in the combustion area, which of course myself and a lot of others involved in. I see Peter Mullinger here, of course, was a key part in all of that work, and the FCT name there. And that led to the burner, which you've shown there, which is actually the reason how we got into the industry sector, because of applying for what was then NOx emissions, the challenge, but applying that in industry. And then as the challenge shifted to decarbonisation, we also then progressively moved into industry decarbonisation. And of course, the Olympic Flames also began under his legacy. And in the air conditioning space, some of you who work in that field will know about the low face velocity, high coolant velocity platform, and that became another company which is also working in that area. So really, a key point about his approach, which is really what we try to continue, is engaging is the critical first step, right? Engaging with industry, with society, identifying what the challenges are, and then providing our own understanding of how we can contribute to that. And of course, that's where the advisory board in our centre plays such a pivotal role in also helping us to identify how we can contribute to that. And then working on where our particular component of the expertise, of course, everyone has got their own niche, and the combination that we bring with our team, then we work out how we think we can contribute to that and establish partnerships to link to that. And of course, Sam was an inspirer. He always talked positively about his team and had absolute confidence in himself and his team, which is exemplified by the statement he made when we were bidding for the Olympic torch. We got the Olympic torch, but we also bidded for to try and do a section which was meant to go underwater, and he said, "Oh, sure, we can make that thing burn underwater," and that was a key. He had absolute confidence in that. So our centre, I don't need to read through all this because David's already talked about some of these points, but you see the photo. I guess this is some of the mix of also illustrating our journey from combustion with solar thermal, with hydrogen is the right-hand fuel, with all kinds of photocatalysis, and Greg's work, I'll show you another image of that as we move forward. A lot of thermochemical processing, starting with coal and now biomass and syngas, refuse-derived fuels as part of that mix. Wind turbines, and the three forums that were mentioned are all shown in this mix of images. And I guess now the key areas where we see our centre can continue to make a contribution in the challenges going forwards to accelerate this transition are really in the areas of minerals and processing, which includes green metals, in the alternative fuel systems, which includes hydrogen, but all these other feedstock, including the secure power and networks and the built environment, and particularly as we as the merger goes ahead, a lot of the UniSA capability will come in throughout those, but particularly in the latter part of that, and some of those images highlighting some of the larger scale systems which we seem to try to link the smaller scale and the larger scale, including the image of what looks like perhaps a small solar concentrator is actually the photocatalysis stuff that Greg and his team have been leading. And on the left, the images of some of the minerals processing, high temperature for thermal pre-treatment of ores. So without going into all that detail, of course, we have many partners, and these are the partners in the HILT CRC, but we're really grateful to all of our partners, and of course, universities don't actually build things, it's the partners who do it. We need the partnership to contribute together, so we acknowledge all of our partners, those of which are shown here. But of course, in this process of the Luxton Lecture, we also try to identify someone who really has a leading role in trying to identify the bigger picture of how technology and policy can intersect. And so we're really excited when Alison Reeve accepted our invitation to take this lecture, but I'll leave that to Susan to give the formal introduction, but she's a great fitting contributor in this legacy. Thank you all.
Thank you, Gus. A lot of great stuff going on. It's now my pleasure to introduce Alison Reeve, our guest speaker for tonight. Alison is the Director of the Energy and Climate Program at the Grattan Institute. I think most of us would be well aware of what the Grattan Institute is and does. It's a highly valuable contribution to public policy across Australia, and it's a very sought after position. So we were very happy to see you get the energy role after Tony Wood, who has also been a speaker at the Sam Luxton Lecture in the past. You've taken over the role most capably. Alison has had a 20-year career in public policy in the federal government, and she's got a master's degree in public policy analysis. So she brings another aspect to the examination of where we're going with clean energy in Australia. Welcome, Alison.
Susan, thank you very much for that very kind introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here with you tonight on the lands of the Kaurna people, and I also would like to recognise their continuing connection to country and honour their elders past and present, and also extend that respect to Indigenous people who are here tonight. So when Gus invited me to give this lecture, the first thing I had to do before I could reply to the email was to Google who Sam Luxton was. I'm not from Adelaide, so not surprisingly, perhaps I hadn't heard of him. And if you're going to give a lecture in honour of someone, I think it's only polite to kind of know who they were. And Sam Luxton's obituaries described someone who was actually quite extraordinary, I think. Someone who seemed to me to stand at this crossover between innovation and creativity, but also engineering and fundamental science. Someone who encouraged critical thinking and focusing on the bigger picture, and someone who apparently used language efficiently and effectively, which is something I will strive for this evening. And also an engineering professor who made his first year students read Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, in the hope that it would teach them to listen for and be open to alternative paths. As a first year engineering student, I would much prefer to have had to read Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance than Fundamentals of Thermodynamics and several other textbooks. So in that spirit, I decided I would call this lecture From Ambition to Action, because it seemed to me that Sam Luxton was someone who could combine that sort of imagination that you need, but also the practicality that you need to turn ambition into action and make things change in the real world. And while I started out as an engineer, I'm a policy wonk today, and my job also requires thinking about imagination and practicality to bring on change in the best interests of Australians. So tonight I wanted to cover 4 things. I wanted to start with a little bit of big picture about what net zero is and why this is an opportunity for Australia. And then I wanted to talk about 2 roles for policy, industry policy and carbon policy. And then I'm going to come back to the big picture, because I also want to talk about the society and the natural environment and the political environment in which all of this takes place, because all of those affect the size of our ambition and our capacity to deliver on it. So let's start with some big picture things. It is beyond doubt that climate change is happening. In 2024, the World Meteorological Organization identified more than 150 significant climate-related disasters worldwide, from 6 typhoons in a single month in the Philippines to wildfires in the US, Europe and Canada, and also to floods here. As we sit here tonight, there are wildfires raging in southern Europe again, and Scotland, which is not exactly known for its hot, dry climate, is under an extreme fire danger warning. And meanwhile, we have scientists here in South Australia who are undertaking the grim task of assessing damage from the marine heatwave and algal bloom that's devastated 500 kilometres of the southern coast. It's also beyond doubt that climate change is driven by human activity. So yes, the climate has always changed because it has always responded to things that force it. And today, the thing that is forcing it is us. And the more specifically, it is the fossil fuels that we consume to power our lives. Certain amount of climate change, unfortunately, is baked in, as per those 150 events that the World Meteorological Organization identified. The task that is in front of us is to do what we can to stop it from being worse. And this is often shortened to net zero. The idea that if we can balance the carbon dioxide we put into the atmosphere against what can be taken out through natural and other processes, we can help the climate come back to an equilibrium. And that task is largely one of eliminating fossil fuel consumption. Now, for Australia, this has been a really tough problem to grapple with. White settlement and economic growth have coincided almost exactly with the Industrial Revolution, which was only possible because of the extraction and consumption of fossil fuels. The first coal mined in Australia, it was in Newcastle in 1798, so only 10 years after our first permanent white settlement. The first steam engine began operating in 1815. The first mining of ore took place at Glen Osmond in 1841, which was followed soon after by Burra and Kapunda. And the first smelter in Australia, which was also at Glen Osmond, started operating in 1845. By 1850, exports of copper and lead from South Australia earned more than Australia's exports of wool and wheat. We had cars before we had a national parliament. It is very hard to imagine an Australia without fossil fuels. But if we are to reach net zero, we do have to conduct that exercise of imagination. And beyond imagining it, we have to do what we can to make it real. As Sam Luxton might have said, we need to listen for and find an alternative pathway. Now, this exercise of imagination has to start from where we are with what we have. And what we do have in Australia, and I think South Australians probably know this much better than many other states, and particularly those of us over east, what we have in Australia are minerals, lots of them. We have some of the world's best ones. We also have some that aren't particularly the greatest quality compared to other countries, but we have lots of them and they make up for it in quantity and accessibility. And it's also been these minerals that have been behind the growth of modern Australia, whether that's the gold rushes in the 19th century or the iron ore boom that we've been riding since the 2000s. Importantly, the minerals that we have are exactly the ones that will be in demand as the rest of the world moves towards net zero. That iron ore can be used to make steel, to make turbines for wind towers. Towers for wind turbines, pardon me. We've got lots of bauxite, which is used to make aluminium, which provides frames and mounting racks for solar panels. We've got lithium, which is used to make batteries, and we have cobalt, we have copper, we have vanadium, we have zinc. The list goes on and on. But currently, these minerals only have value if we combine them with fossil fuels, because it is fossil fuels that power the process of transforming minerals into metals, metals into components and commodities, and from there into products and services that we want and the rest of the world does too. So where does this leave us, this mineral endowment, if it is no longer an option to use fossil fuels to turn our minerals into metals? Can we find an alternative path? Well, there are other things that we also have in abundance. We have space, we have sunshine, and we have wind. And between these three things, we have access to extraordinary amounts of zero emissions energy. The annual solar radiation that falls on Australia is about 58 million petajoules. If you're not sure how large a petajoule is, this is roughly 10,000 times of our annual energy consumption. It's about 14% of global final energy consumption annually. It's a huge amount of energy. And it's this endowment of zero emissions energy that helps us to flip this story of eliminating fossil fuels from one that's a threat to one that's an opportunity. We put our mineral endowments and our energy endowments together, we can make metals without the emissions, the metals that the world wants, and we can do it without making climate change worse. Potentially, if Australia maintains market share in so-called critical minerals, we can generate twice the export income that we currently earn from coal. And that's before we undertake any value adding in this country. This is the opportunity that comes with net zero, a pathway that could take us to continued prosperity and flourishing in a net zero global economy. Now, I've made all that sound really easy, right? And you can do numbers in a spreadsheet that all add up, and you can write an academic paper, or, plenty of people have written books about this and reports about it and so on. But the vestigial engineer in me knows that it's actually not that simple, because we don't live in spreadsheets. We live here, in the physical world. And turning visions into physical reality is what engineers do. And the role of policymakers is to create the surrounding environment that helps them do it. So there are two parts of policy that I want to talk about in that context: industry policy and carbon policy. These are not substitutes for each other, they are complements. And we need to do both of them to support the transition to net zero and to grasp the opportunities that it will bring us. Now, governments use industry policy when they want to alter the structure of their economy and to try and encourage resources to move into sectors that they think are desirable for future development. Industry policy can help make markets more efficient by correcting for underinvestment in research and development. When a market player develops a green technology, other firms can just, once that's happened, can use that knowledge without sharing in the costs. This is often called technology spillover. And as a result, firms actually have little incentive to do deep investment into research and development, because why should they if their competitors could just take advantage of them? Technology spillover is actually even more relevant when we're talking about clean energy technology, because they tend to be particularly complex and uncertain, and therefore more costly to do R&D on. If the market alone is not going to drive breakthrough innovations, government must have policy to do so. This is why we have ARC grants, we have universities doing research, we have CSIRO, and we have CRCs, for example. Now, it used to be fashionable to say that's enough for government, that all that government should do is to remove that early stage technology spillover risk and everything else would happen by itself. The thing is that it's not enough. Many of the key technologies that we need to decarbonise are already known, because we've already been through that stage of government-supported research and development. The International Energy Agency estimates that about half of the cumulative emissions reductions needed to achieve net zero by 2050 worldwide will come from technologies that are at the demonstration or the prototype stage. These technologies need investment to become commercially viable. The thing is that they are expensive and their performance is uncertain, and therefore they're not attractive to investors. In financial jargon, they're not bankable. Investing in low emissions capital is more expensive, and early investors face higher costs than followers. This isn't just about the cost of the kit. It's because finance costs, effectively interest rates that you pay as an early stage investor, are higher for something that's new and not well understood. The other part of this problem is that many low emissions industrial products are materially the same as the emissions intensive ones. Green steel and traditional steel will look the same and they'll feel the same, and they will largely have the same properties. So it's hard to sell green steel on the idea as it's somehow better, and ask people to pay more for it when it doesn't physically do anything that traditional steel did. Even if there were enough people who were willing to pay this green premium, early movers can't bank the full value of that because the profitability of green investments is strongly affected by political factors. So, you might have, for example, a green steel plant, you might have someone who's willing to buy your green steel because they think the policy settings are a certain way, and then you have a change of government in that country, those settings change, suddenly the bottom falls out of your green premium. All of this increases the risk of investing into new green technology. And then finally, the other reason we need industry policy is because our existing industrial assets have lifespans. A new clean technology might be proven at the demonstration scale, but if it's still high cost when a major facility reaches a refurbishment point, then that refurbishment is more likely to use the incumbent and polluting technology rather than the new clean alternative. It's the capital cycle as well as the innovation process that drives change in large-scale industrial facilities. Industry policy is how we get over these barriers. It's a way that governments share risk with industry. Industry policy puts the government balance sheet behind technology change, but does it in a way that reduces the need for government support over time. Industry policy is there to share risk if the capital cycle dictates that an asset has to be replaced, but the new tech is still more expensive. Industry policy is what speeds up the journey from the lab to the bank. Now, industry policy is back in vogue worldwide because countries are grappling with the challenge of getting to net zero within roughly the next 25 years. That challenge is a change that is, as I would say, as profound as the original industrial revolution. It's just that we're doing it on a much shorter time frame and on a much more critical deadline. Australia is still feeling its way a bit with industry policy. We have some good examples. For example, we created a pretty good funding ecosystem to drive the renewable energy sector from around 8% of electricity to around 40%. And we are on track to get it to something, the government's aim is 82%. I reckon we can hit 75% by 2030. And that's an incredible success story. And largely we did that with industry policy. But we have also had some missteps, to be honest. We put up, I think, too much money via industry policy for hydrogen before the industry was ready to absorb it. And as a result, I think we undermined confidence in the future role of hydrogen as an alternative fuel. There is also a little bit of a worrying trend at the moment towards announcing billion-dollar green funds for this industry or for that industry before the policy design work has actually been done to determine what this industry or that industry actually needs to decarbonise. You could call me cynical for saying this, but sometimes these announcements seem to be timed more to prevent distressed facilities from collapsing financially than they are to provide structured and long-term policy support. And the thing is about these missteps is that they trigger people to criticise industry policy and say that we shouldn't do it. The first criticism that people make is that governments are not best placed to set the direction of the economy. This argument says that governments just don't have enough information to choose which industries or which firms should be supported, and that governments should not pick winners, but rather rely on market forces to determine who should win in this race. In my view, the risk is not so much picking winners as losers picking the government. Because when that happens, governments have little capacity left to support willing and viable firms that could be engines of future growth. And this risk can be addressed by good policy design. Government support for industry should resemble a portfolio. Governments should choose a direction that the economy should head in. Net zero is a good one. Our interim targets about our emissions reductions are other ones. And then they should choose not winners, but the willing, the companies that are willing to take the risks and make the investment to transform. Now, if we think about this as an investment portfolio, it's inevitable that some of those bets will fail, and we should expect that, and we should be comfortable with it. The key is not to bail out of this as soon as some projects fall over. It is to have Good design in your policy, so you have clear guidelines on when you pull the plug on things that aren't working out, and ways that you can quickly redirect that support into things that look more prospective. Similarly, governments need to have a broad range of the tools that they use to share the risk with industry. So not just grants, but also recoupable grants that can be paid back if things succeed. They can have things like low interest loans. They can participate in underwriting or even take equity. And the thing about all of these is that it also means that when we do put together a portfolio of winners, governments and therefore the taxpayer share in that upside. The second criticism that people make about industry policy is that it has a risk of rent seeking, that well-connected firms might be able to use their financial power, their connections and their influence to get their hands on money from government. Now, rent seeking happens in all sorts of things, not just in industry policy, and the solution to it is usually you have better institutional design. What this means is that the governance structure that you have over the decisions about who gets the money is very fundamental. Really, to put it bluntly, the further at arm's length you can make that funding decision happen from a minister, the more chance you have of keeping rent seekers out of it. Funding administrators really need to have clear targets and milestones for deploying funding, and like I said before, criteria that they use to pull back funding when it's obvious that these aren't being met. They need to have accountability and transparency around their governments. What this protects us from is the temptation which faces every industry minister, which is to prop up uncompetitive incumbent firms to preserve jobs and call that your industry policy. Now, the third criticism that people make of industry policy is that carbon pricing or a carbon tax could do it better. It would be more efficient. As I said earlier, carbon policy and industry policy are complements, not substitutes. Carbon prices and taxes are very effective at speeding up the deployment of new technology once it's proven, once it's widely available, and once it's been commercially tested. If you have a shelf full of solutions that will help you get to net zero, a carbon price will take those technologies off the shelf and deploy them in the economically efficient order. What it doesn't do is put the technology on the shelf in the first place. It doesn't lower that early stage risk that I talked about before. And this is why we need industry policy alongside any carbon policy that we have. Now, the thing is, though, that the reverse is also true. Because if we want to capture these opportunities that we get from net zero, we are going to need very large amounts of capital, and that is going to be well beyond what any government balance sheet can bear. It's not enough to use industry policy to make the new way of doing things cheaper. We can move faster if we make the old way of doing things more expensive and less attractive. And this is where carbon policy comes in. Now, I'm saying carbon policy and not carbon tax, which is usually the shorthand that people use, because we actually have lots of options in how we make polluters pay for the damage that carbon emissions cause, and not all of these are taxes. But all of them have one thing in common, which is that if we want people to use less fossil fuel, we have to make it harder for them to use it. Australia is doing this a little bit in the industrial sector, but I think we could do it a little better. Currently, our largest 200 or so industrial facilities face a constraint on how much carbon they're allowed to emit. This is called the safeguard mechanism. It's the little carbon price that you've never heard of. What it does is it applies an emissions cap on each large industrial facility. If the facility emits less than its cap, it gets a credit. And if it goes over the cap, it has to buy a credit from another facility or buy an offset that represents a reduction in emissions elsewhere in the economy. Over time, the caps on emissions on each of these facilities will come down, and that will have an effect of forcing facilities to change their processes to stay under their caps, or to do that in order to avoid having to buy credits and offsets as the cap comes down. And this functions as a price on carbon. It's just one that doesn't raise revenue for the government in the way that a tax does. And at the moment, because of the very cheap price of offsets compared to, for example, building a green steel plant, and the fact that the caps are quite high, it represents a very low price on carbon, around $7 per tonne of emissions. Now, $7 per tonne, just for context, is only about 1/10 of the social cost of carbon, which is our best guess at the economic value of the damage that a tonne of carbon emissions causes. And it's a tiny percentage of the cost gap at the moment between green production and current production for lots of green products, including green iron, green ammonia, and green alumina. The carbon price that is embodied in the safeguard mechanism will grow over time, but it's not going to bring about transformative change while companies are allowed to transfer all of their liability for emissions to other sectors of the economy by using offsets. Next year, the federal government is going to review the operations of the safeguard mechanism, and this would actually be a good opportunity for us to talk about revising the settings so that it supports faster deployment of modern and green technology and actually underpins the government's Future Made in Australia vision much better by encouraging investment into things like green iron, green ammonia, and green alumina. Now, I said revise and not sweep away. There are voices at the moment in the public debate who are calling very strongly for just a simple carbon tax, and I don't think that that's the practical path to take at the moment. And that's because carbon tax it's a toxic phrase in Parliament and with politicians. It's a phrase that starts fights. And very few politicians, I think, can resist the temptation to weaponise the fear of taxes in order to gain politically. And I don't particularly like this, but that's just kind of where our political culture is at. And that's the environment that we have to work within. A sudden switch to having a carbon tax, in my view, will chill investment for at least 5 years because we'll have to have a fight about it, and then a government will have to take it to an election. And then depending on the outcome of that election, you either have to throw it away, and in the process of doing that, you've poisoned the idea of doing anything about carbon emissions for another generation or so. Or if you win the election on the basis of having a carbon tax, you then have to do the design and implementation work. And the thing is, we don't have 5 years to waste. Earlier, I was talking about the relentless nature of the capital cycle and how facilities get replaced. That cycle doesn't stop for climate wars. And that cycle is quite a long one. Industrial facilities have a major capital investment roughly every 25 to 30 years. And that means that between now and our net zero deadline in 2050, each facility's got about one chance to make that big decision about whether they shift to a low emissions technology. And if that chance is missed, we lock the emissions in for another 30 years. Now, industry policy is helpful with this because it is bringing forward those options to use, and it can be used to close the gap if the finances don't quite work out at the refurbishment point. But the other thing that helps industry with planning those refurbishments is knowing that carbon policy is going to be consistent, rather than having to plan for there being political biffo every 3 years about it. The best pathway that we've got for our industrial sector is to reform what we've got now so that it's more effective, and evolve it over time so that it gives us the same outcomes as a so-called simple but politically impossible carbon tax. This way, we can maximise the benefits of the big investment that the government is making into industry policy. And over time, as technology matures, we can allow carbon policy to start taking those things off the shelf and deploying them and taking over as the driver of emissions reductions. Now, it's probably obvious from what I was saying there that industry policy and carbon policy don't take place in a vacuum. They take place within a political environment, and they also sit within a bigger picture that describes who we are as a country, who we are as Australians, how we collectively imagine our future, and how we wish to behave towards each other and towards our natural environment. Australia's net zero opportunity is based on abundant space, abundant mineral resources, and abundant renewable energy. But we have not always been particularly clever or careful in how we have made the most of these natural endowments, and we have the opportunity to be better. So yes, There is abundant space in Australia compared to other countries to host renewable projects and dig up minerals and process them. But every square metre of that space has value to somebody somewhere. It might be the pasture value for a farmer. It might be the cultural value for a traditional owner. It might be the ecosystem value of a national park. And we have to take into account that value when we are thinking about our policy settings for getting to net zero. And currently we are not doing very well at coming together to negotiate who gets to use our abundant space and for what. In mining, we have a pretty sad history of digging up as much as possible, as fast as possible, and selling it for as much as possible, with little regard for what this did to fragile ecosystems or cultural heritage, and without securing the long-term prosperity of future generations. In energy right now, there are fault lines emerging in communities that might host new renewable generation about the impacts of this infrastructure on collective and individual values around land and space. In my view, the common thread between these is ultimately about fairness, that there are benefits to be had from digging up and processing minerals, and there are benefits to be had from building and operating renewable energy to power this process. But there are also costs. And if the benefits and the costs are not being fairly shared, then most of us realise that we won't prosper. And if we feel that something isn't fair, we tend to reject it. For Australians to seize the opportunities that net zero brings, Australians have to feel that net zero is theirs, something that is done by Australians and for Australians, not to Australians. Something where the benefits and the costs are shared fairly. Historically, Australian governments have not made much out of mining and resources booms compared to what they could have done. And they haven't saved the revenue either. They've tended to spend it as soon as they get it. We can only dig these resources up once. It's imperative that state and federal governments restructure their royalty and their resource taxes before we have a net zero mining boom, so that these can generate shared and lasting prosperity for coming generations, and so that the spoils don't accrue to just a few billionaires. It's also imperative that we reform our national environmental laws. Our current laws have this unique characteristic in that almost everyone hates them. Environment groups don't like them because the laws mostly fail to protect the environment. Companies who are seeking to mine or to develop renewables programs don't like the laws because they're basically a labyrinth, a maze. They're inconsistent, approvals are lengthy, and they generate a lot of uncertainty. Reform of these laws is long overdue, and it needs to reflect the value that Australians place on our natural heritage, as well as having something in it that really pushes us towards that net zero prosperous future. The thing is, though, that this is not just about laws and taxes and royalties and so on. All of the policy in the world can't create a sense of national purpose that is shared by all citizens. The journey to net zero is going to touch the lives of every single Australian. Everyone is going to have a part to play in it. And that's the story that needs to be told over and over, not just so that people understand, but so they can prepare and they can participate and they can benefit. I would have loved to enlist Sam Luxton to this task because it seems from everything I read about him that he was a brilliant communicator and he would have been really good at it and really helpful. But seeing as he's no longer with us, I instead wanted to circle back to a quote that from the text that he assigned to his first year students, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, which is this: "The place to improve the world is first in one's own heart and head and hands, and then we work outward from there." Thank you for your time tonight.
Well, thank you very much, Alison. That was a very, I suspect, clear and logical summary of where we're at with our decarbonisation vision in Australia. And just on behalf of politicians, I have to say something. In oh no, not at all. The EPBC Act that you referred to, I think it was 1999. I was working for Robert Hill, the then Environment Minister, the Federal Environment Minister. And in our office, there was such joy and optimism that we thought we'd done a really good thing. The fact that we'd beaten most Queensland members of the Liberal and National Party, and we'd certainly beaten the National Party, and got that act through the Parliament with John Howard's support. And it's really sad for me to watch that. And I watched Ken Henry give his address to the Press Club, where he urged Australia to take on the task of revitalising our environment protection laws. And I couldn't agree with him more. So that's a huge task ahead of us all, and something that we really should all get behind. So thank you very much again. And I can see why you're doing what you're doing at the Grattan Institute. You've got a very good grasp on the very broad picture that we're all dealing with. So now I'd like to invite the rest of the panellists to come up to the stools here. And I'll just tell you a little bit about who is joining Alison and Gus tonight. First of all, it'll be pretty obvious to you which one she is. Professor Melissa Nursey-Bray. She's the Deputy Director of ISER, the Institute for Sustainability and Energy Resources. She's an ARC Future Fellow in Human Geography, and her research focuses on the connection between people and the environment. And Professor Peter Draper, Executive Director of the Institute for International Trade in the Faculty of the Professions, and he has extensive research projects and positions across economics, commerce and trade across the world. So welcome very much to Melissa and Peter to the panel as well. And I think at the end of your presentation, you started to talk about cost and benefits and fairness. And that's something that anybody who goes into politics really wants to do, really should do. And I'd like to get Melissa's perspective on this. Melissa, how do we demand from our politicians, how do we empower communities to ask for what is fair and to balance the costs and the benefits to all of us? And I thought, given your work, you might be the best person to sort of start a conversation around this. Not sure how
Thank you very much. That's a huge question to start off with. Yeah, I don't know. I think there's a range of sort of answers to that question in terms of how we motivate politicians to get the will, to get the policy that we need, and to work with industry and the partnerships that we need. And I think, you know, a few things that come to mind. I think getting a social licence to operate and in the partnerships between the people that are going to be making the decarbonisation and operating with the politicians to build that kind of nexus between industry, community and, you know, politics is really important. But I think in terms of people, you know, it's such a complicated area. I mean, you've touched on so many complicated issues, and basically people just don't understand. I just really think generally people go around going, oh my God, the sky's going to fall on my head and I don't know what's going on, but it's not good and I don't know what to do. So I think part of the exercise of motivating the political will by motivating people is providing a series of opportunities where people can get engaged. So I think education and clear communication about what's going on and all the sort of policy frames is really important. I think incentivising people is really important. I mean, I'm sure we'd all love to drive an electric vehicle, but most of us can't afford it. So how are you going to put those structures in place to make those kind of conversations where people are willing to do it? How do you reconcile, finding ways of reconciling the tensions between, oh, I want to run cattle on my property and you want to put an energy farm on it? How are you going to, reconcile and find ways to deal with those conflicts, I think is another really important dimension. But I think also there's a really big piece there for me about technology, having the technology, and in many ways already having the technology, but exercising it so that we implement it in a timely fashion so we actually make the transition. And I think for a lot of people, particularly industries that form the communities that are the actors that we want to actually, fund and support, they need access to that technology. They need affordable access to that technology and the incentives and the policy frames to do it. So I think it's something for me about building community engagement and palatability around the future, which appears grim, and give people some hope that there are pathways forward. But don't do that in a policy way that offers accessibility, affordability and incentives for people to then put the pressure on the governments that will go, okay then, we're building this partnership, we're taking the people with us, and we need to do it, and we need to do it now.
Do you see any good examples of where that happens?
That's the kind of thing, it's like, yeah, I can think of many, but not right now. Look, I think increasingly there are a lot of sort of different models of community-based energy and conversations where academics and industry are working together. You know, people like in ISER and SET that are building true partnerships. You know, the conversations that the Grattan Institute and others are having, because in the end it's about making it affordable, achievable and realistic. And so I do think those things are happening. I can't think of any specific exact examples right now, but I do think there are a lot of industries and institutions that are really starting to build that conversation. I feel myself, I've been part of that. I've, you know, started to work with ISER a year or so ago, and I really felt coming in as a social scientist, where my work is galvanised around engaging communities on environmental decision making and trying to get that research to have impact in practice. I really feel that, you know, a whole world opened up to me about this area, and where there really is a multiplicity of efforts happening. And I think we also need to look at international best practice in this area. There are a lot of really interesting initiatives happening internationally. We've just come back from a trip to Vietnam where, you know, the whole country is looking at net zero and, you know, investing in research partnerships and technologies. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there. I agree with you, it's a real opportunity, and it's about closing the deal and working out where those opportunities are, and then building up and showcasing and advertising the good things that are happening to offset some of that, what I think is very genuine grief and fear in the community.
Thank you very much.
There is one example I could maybe talk about a bit, which is an area around Hay in southwest New South Wales, so that's kind of the area that butts up against the South Australian border. And this is an identified renewable energy zone, which means it is going to have a lot of development coming into it, so new transmission lines, wind farms, solar farms and so on. And in that area, it was a very proactive local council who thought, okay, if all of this stuff is coming in, we're going to set some parameters around how we expect people to engage with our community when they come in. And so they did a lot of work with their community to sort of, not just to sell this opportunity, but also to understand what the concerns were. And that meant they were able to go to wind and solar developers and also the transmission companies and say, well, these are the areas that people have really said they don't want anything on, so maybe you should avoid those. And people are really worried about what a great big influx of construction workers is going to do to housing prices. So what can you bring to our town that will, you know, help alleviate that problem, whether that's, you know, temporary housing or permanent investment in housing or whatever else. And so I think often it's down to, it's not just about how companies behave when they go to host communities, it's also about those communities having the tools and the proactive kind of way of helping their community to be an equal partner within those developments.
Yeah, I just had one thing to add there. I think, like, as you were talking, I think often when you're thinking about net zero, you're thinking about technology and you're thinking about like the solar farm or the wind farm. But one of the things that strikes me lately is you do have like every industry in every sector, like with the sector plans, has an opportunity to implement actions towards the transition. So it might not be, you know, putting in a wind farm, but it could be, for example, implementing a nature-based solution in rice production in Vietnam, which is going to help towards, you know, all sorts of management and governance, which is in effect helping towards the transition. So I think in all the other sectors, there are these other kinds of transition actions which people don't necessarily typify as transition because they think, oh, it's not a solar farm or renewable energy or hydrogen, but it is in fact the transition. And I think in that case there are lots of different examples I could think of, nature-based solutions and other ways in which people are incentivised, but they're not necessarily characterised, I think, in the discourse that is what they're doing.
Peter, do you sort of see any best practice policy options globally that ensure that this sort of process is embedded in negotiations over new projects?
I don't really focus on the project level per se, more about the broader policy settings, the trade policy settings. I suppose maybe I can comment on that, but probably one of the key market leaders would be the European Union. That's a jurisdiction I tend to follow quite closely. What worries me about the way the debate is going in the European Union is that the pendulum is swinging away from the green transition. It's not entirely against the green transition, but there certainly is a lot of backsliding. And that reflects a broader set of trends, starting perhaps in the United States, where the Trump administration has been systematically unraveling most of the Biden administration initiatives to promote the green transition. And their main concern, underlying concern, is the competitiveness costs that imposes on US industry, or allegedly imposes on US industry. And so the Europeans are responding to that, and you're seeing that reflected in their politics. And so the competitiveness dimension, all of this, I do think is a very important consideration. And Australia is not an island in its own right, but what does that mean practically? And what is the role of policies like border carbon adjustments, for instance? Because on the one hand, they can offer industries in Australia, thinking the safeguard mechanism, the space to adjust. But on the other hand, imposing new border taxes imposes taxes on other industries. And so there could be costs further downstream or even further upstream. And I think also just in terms of Alison's presentation, which I was in furious agreement with for the most part, but I was looking for areas to constructively disagree, or at least to ask questions. Maybe this could receive more attention. But in the international debate, fossil fuel subsidies is a huge issue that every country grapples with addressing. In Australia's case, the last time I looked at this, Perplexity told me that about $15 billion was spent on fossil fuel subsidies last year alone. Most of those went to the mining industry. Now, there may be good reasons for those subsidies. It's a complicated debate. And I see Alison shaking her head. But my point is there might be other things we could be looking at to speed the transition along from a broad policy point of view.
The reason I was shaking my head is what most of that subsidy is the fuel tax credit. So this gives mining companies back the fuel excise that they pay for diesel. And for every 1,000 litres of diesel that they burn, they pay probably around $3 for the emissions on that, and they get back fuel tax credits that are probably around $30 or more. So that credit is just sending a signal that's in the wrong direction. And I think it's part of a bigger thing that, there's been a lot of talk about tax this week because of the Treasurers' roundtables and so on, but this is one of the things that we really need to think about for getting to net zero, is what are all the settings in our tax system that are sending signals to people to go in the other direction, to not go in the net zero direction. And that's sort of a fundamental that needs to be looked at. And it's not just fuel tax credits, it's also things like road user charging, the way that capital gains tax applies. But I'm not going to have a tax discussion tonight because I feel like I escaped the vortex of productivity roundtables this week. So it'd be much more fun to talk about tech, I think.
There you go, Gus. We've avoided talking about tech until now. Gus, what's on the horizon that has to come on more quickly? What can Alison advocate for when she's talking to governments about industry policy and the things that need to happen to accelerate the transition?
Yeah, great. Firstly, I'd just like to add my thanks to Alison's presentation. I thought it was excellent. And you really put together a great overview of the context and the opportunities. So thank you. I guess there's a number of points to bring to the discussion. One is that we're a part of global supply chains, as obviously Peter mentioned, and a lot of our trading partners are based in Asia, and hence the good thing is that although they have there's differences in the Chinese, for example, decarbonisation schedule, our Asian partners still have got a commitment to the net zero transition. So this is a really important anchor point for our ongoing investment in this area. Second point is I think it's really important that we base everything on output, not on input. Output is simply what CO2, net CO2 emissions come, rather than saying we should do it this way or that way. Politicians end up skewing the market or skewing problems if they say you have to do it via this kind of investment in this technology as opposed to that one. And we simply should be looking at the output, which means we need to include things like CO2, capture, reuse, whatever platform is in there. We need to include all options on the table but we do need to make sure there's no biases in there, which is, I guess, the other point that Alison made. And so I think, we need to be focused on the outputs, recognising that we're in global supply chains, and also, I guess, being aware that certainly there's some things we can start to do today, and we should be absolutely identifying them, but also there's a lot of uncertainty as what technology platforms are going to be most viable in 10 or 20 years' time, because it's a very rapidly changing feast. But also not all technologies are there yet. There's definitely a lot that we can start to do, but certainly in the heavy industry, high temperature processes, there are some parts that can start to be done today, but other bits are simply not economically, the technology is not there yet as to how to do it. So we need to be investing in better understanding what those things look like, and being at the forefront of that, some of which is at the learning by doing, but we certainly need to be investing in what's coming as well as what we can do today. They're all important part of this mix, because what net zero 2050 looks like is whatever any of us think is probably not going to be exactly that. We do know part of it, and we definitely need to be keeping options open, but really focused on the actual real number, which is the CO2 rate coming down, not how any person A, B, C or thinks is the best way for a given group to do it.
Thanks, Gus. Anyone else from the panel have a comment on where we've got to?
I just want to make a broader comment, is that, I, like everybody else, is really hoping that tech's going to save us. But I also think we need to think about transformation of society as well. And so, yeah, I agree. It's the output, and, there's many ways of getting there, and it's not just going to be technology. And, I'm a, white middle class, affluent female living in a society where I enjoy the fruits of everything that we're doing that is contributing to climate change. And so my question for myself, but also for everyone else, is it's not just about technology. It's like, what are, and speaks to the first question you asked me, what are the modes by which society itself, as individuals, as collectives, as whole communities and societies, are going to work out how to live in a different way, a less carbon heavy way? And that might sound idealistic, but I do think it needs to be in the mix somewhere, because there are a lot of people on the planet and it's a very big ask, and technology is in the mix. And, like everyone else, I'm hoping for the tech miracle. But if it doesn't happen, we need to be working on other things as well. That's just one of my takes on that whole question.
It's really interesting, isn't it, that we're very good as humans in imagining funky new futuristic technologies, and we're very poor at imagining social change. So if you look at, say, a cartoon like the Jetsons, right, they can imagine a world where George Jetson commutes in a spacecraft, but his wife still doesn't have a job and she still stays at home. They couldn't imagine that was the future. And you see this whenever you look at, you can find things that people published in the 1920s of how life will be in the 1990s. And all of the social structures seem to stay intact. But the other thing that we know is that social change can also happen incredibly fast, right? That change from women staying home to women, being here, doing what we're doing, was like maybe 1.5 generations. It was really quick.
Gus, I was thinking about that earlier when Alison was talking. Is Alison the first woman to give the Sam Luxton Lecture?
Absolutely, yeah. And a great choice, so thank you.
It was a great
Alison.
choice, but there's a challenge again for next year.
Very much hope I'm not the last one.
You won't be. Are there any other comments before we go to the audience? Are there any questions of our panellists? Over here. We have mics. Oh, we've got a mic coming. And can you say your name and where you're from if you ask a question?
Thank you very much. Tennant Reid from the Australian Industry Group. My question is for Alison, but anybody else is welcome to have a go too. To the idea of the gradual evolution and reform of the safeguard mechanism, where with a change here and a change there, before too long you've got a safeguard of Theseus that's a different policy. What do you think is the speed limit on that rate of change in the policy, and how does that compare to the speed limit on the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere? Easy one.
Yeah, easy. So some of the speed limit question comes down to people having options that they can exercise to reduce their emissions, because for some sectors, I'm thinking about cement, for example, at the moment, anything that you put on them is just going to function as a carbon tax and make cement more expensive. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because and this sort of comes back to your thing about social change as well, is that some of our options are to stop using certain things in the quantities that we use them now. And so if what that does is it means that people look for alternatives to cement that can do the things that we need it to do structurally, then that's not necessarily a bad outcome. So I think some of it comes down to that. But some of it is also about whether you broaden it out to different sectors, because at the moment it really only covers the large industrials, the airlines, and a couple of freight companies. And we know that there are options available for heavy vehicles now, right? The electric trucks exist, they are manufactured, they're still more expensive than conventional trucks, but they work. And so at the moment, we don't have something that can bring those on, and we're just putting all of the burden onto the industrial sector and to light vehicles. So some of it is also coming down to that if you broaden it out, you have to make fewer decisions about the pace of change, because there will be someone somewhere who can move at the speed that you want to go.
Question here, blue shirt, hand up. One over there and then one behind you.
Thanks very much for the great talk. For social policy, ultimately the question is, how do we convince Western societies to consume way less stuff? How are you going to do that?
Is that your job, Melissa?
I don't know, it's the carrot or the stick, like in terms of social policy. I think often people in this area, they refer to COVID and what happened during COVID. The fact that you can create change in a very, very short space of time, not just in the technology to produce a vaccine, but you can, under pressure, you can, in this case, by force, maybe because of quarantine, but there was a whole lot of ways where people immediately changed what they were doing in different ways. So I think the trick to social policy is to work out that trick. How do you find a way to enforce policy frames and incentives, a bit of a push and a pull that will encourage people to actually make that change. But it is also a very big cultural shift. I mean, if you look at just the transition from getting rid of plastic bags, the use of plastic bags, there's almost generations that to encourage that, so that people now do that, and it's something that we might do in our common practice. But it's like what I say, to PhD students, like for their examiners, keep it simple, stupid. Don't make the person work really, really hard for it. And bottom line is, that's what we're like as humans. Find ways to create policy frames that create social behavioural change that don't make us all really work hard for it. Make it easy. Now that's not an easy answer. That's like all things simple, it's really hard. But ultimately, people need to be given the opportunities to do the right thing. And that's why government and policy and research and politics and technology all still really matter, because collectively they can provide, I think, those portals to help people go, yeah, you know, I will reduce less energy. I'm going to change my mindset and go, you know what, I'm going to buy an apartment instead of a 3-bedroom flat for one house for one person with an acreage. I'm going to, you know, maybe consume less meat. I'm going to do all these things that collectively will reduce. I'm not going to have a, you know, huge cement, you know, carbon-rich kind of thing. I'm going to change what I do, because it is culturally and morally acceptable in my society now to behave in that way. But it's a really big partnership to make that transformative change. And Western society is particularly bedevilled with all of these needs and wants, and the rest of the world wants to be like the Western society. So it's continuing that conversation. But sometimes I think, you know, a little bit of a big stick with a big carrot, it goes a long way. And so, you know, government and governance, I still think has a really big role to help industry and community work together to make that social change.
Well, those of us who are South Australians have seen the PV uptake, the record PV uptake here, people willing to do things, but it seems you've got to have an enemy, to a power company to fight against in order to be incentivised. I think there was someone over here who had their hand up before. No? Then up to the man behind the man with the blue shirt.
Going on from that, yes, householders were very good at taking up solar PV on their rooftops. But there is a stat that says only 13% of available rooftop is used for PV in Australia. What about some policy to incentivise those industries with lots of available rooftop to put some PV on? It might take some of the pressure off some of those renewable energy zones.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen some work that people have done of sort of, you know, looking at how much rooftop would you have to cover with solar panels to avoid a transmission line, for example, and it is pretty doable. There's a couple of things that you have to manage for. So one is that a lot of rooftops are over buildings that are occupied by people who don't own them. And so you kind of got to get around the split between the landlord and the tenant, that it's often the tenant who benefits but the landlord who pays. And no one has really cracked that problem at scale anywhere in the world. But that doesn't mean it's not crackable. It just means that it's hard, and we should do the things that are hard. The other thing about it is that if you want to have that much solar, you have to have an enormous amount of storage, because all of that solar is great for 8 hours a day, but the times that we need energy are much more spread out than that. And so the question that we're really having to grapple with in energy markets now is not straight up how do we get more solar, is how do we get more storage so that we can actually use energy at the time that we need it. And I mean, that has actually been another really surprising technological development, like the way that batteries have improved and come down in price over probably about the last, I don't know, maybe 10 years, would you reckon? And I think, interestingly, some of that was also because of electric vehicles and because Tesla was basically a battery company that chose to make batteries sexy by attaching them to cars. And it's actually been that vehicle market and the change in the vehicle market that's driven the change in the battery market, which will then drive the change in the energy market. And then also potentially in how we build and operate buildings as well. So,
yeah, look, I think I'd just like to add a few comments to this, but the point Alison made, which obviously you're aware of, John, is about the variability in managing this and understanding that we need to balance supply and demand, and hence I think it's an area that needs more understanding, particularly when it comes to the non-domestic user, when we talk about industrial processes. And there we also need to recognise that simply electrifying everything is not as straightforward as is often thought, and that there is also, I think, a need for fuels in this mix. The same with, obviously, things like air transportation, as well as heavy industry processes, which currently are driven by high temperatures. So, we need to also be planning around the alternative fuels mix, some of which may come from obvious biomass type resources, but then there's also potentially synthetic fuels. And also, I think probably in the transition, there'll be some CCUS kind of vectors as well. This is not really completely understood. They need because does get very complex, but certainly what we have seen is as we get a higher and higher penetration of renewables, there's an increasing fraction of need for transmission. And this is not part of the market, so this part of it just gets, well, we need to have this here, but it gets put back to our cost of the system. So we definitely need to have a greater understanding of, and there's many variations in this. Part of it is better demand control, where it can happen. Part of it is definitely storage, and then fuels is part of the mix as well. But it's something that we certainly have got a lot more learning that needs to be done to understand the wide range of energy needs in our society and how to best manage them and get them to net zero most cost effectively. But there's many parts of that challenge that we need to look at.
Roz.
There's a microphone.
Shouldn't have worn heels, Jen.
Click the button, I think,
Ah, the green button. Thanks very much for your talk, Alison. Appreciated that. Coming from the vandals of the universe, that'd be the cement industry and the lime industry, I'm very keen to see industry policy not just reflect industry, but see sectors and the progress they've made. And I think Gus has led a lot to this. Do you want to just take that on board a bit further of what sectors can do?
Yeah, look, Ros, this is really important. It definitely is not a one-size-fits-all, as you obviously know well from that sector. And I think Alison already pointed to the fact that currently the safeguard mechanism is a really good and important start. But each industry sector is quite different, and I think we need to have a better understanding of how each sector can most prospectively transition, because we don't want to put a mechanism that works for one industry but another one makes it uncompetitive, which is the point that Peter made. But we still have to make sure. So part of this is around, for example, I think in the cement industry, we can see probably some steps that could be done relatively straightforwardly, such as maybe bringing in some, be it a calcined clay or some supplementary cementitious material that could be done, for example, by repurposing some current plant. But that would need to be done at a certain scale that is already there, making use of existing plants that are already there. So we need to have a detailed knowledge of what our industry can do and put a policy that helps them transition and makes them competitive, and not introduces something that would make them uncompetitive against an international dumping. But if we work with our industry, understand what are realistic steps, and then put in procurement policies for that match that case. But it certainly absolutely needs a bespoke understanding of each sector, and making sure that we understand, engage with the sector, and put in policies that incentivise them to take steps that are realistic, that can be made without too much investment, and actually makes it attractive for our industry to be at the forefront for the local context. So it really needs that nuanced understanding. So thank you for raising that point.
One more question, Greg, if we've got time. The man up here, we're getting a bit tight on time, so... Sorry, this gentleman was next, sorry. Oh, was he? Yes. Oh, sorry.
Is it okay? Yeah, my name is Harry from Institute for International Trade. I'm Peter's colleague. My question is to Alison. I think it's very fantastic landscape or framework of industrial policy and carbon policy complementary roles. But I was just wondering if you could probably picture it as well in terms of like the border crossing effects of other jurisdictions. So quite recent example is industrial policy by Indonesia, by Indonesian government, practically kills nickel industry in Australia. So, and that's industrial policy. And the carbon policy itself, the CBAM, they already mentioned, I guess, and relate to Tennant's point, I guess, does it affect the speed limit of the putting on the shelf? And so on and so forth. Thank you.
I think that's a really good point. I think this comes back to sort of what Peter was talking a bit about before as well, is that Australia's, well, we are an island, but we're not an island. And actually, when you think about all of these, you know, all of the things we do, like whether it's mining nickel or mining iron ore or whatever, are one end of a really long supply chain. And the decarbonisation story needs to happen all along that supply chain. And that supply chain has a geography to it, that each stage of that supply chain can happen in a different country. And one of the things about when you start to look at how you decarbonise each bit of it, often what you do is you rearrange the geography of that supply chain, because it turns out that different countries have different comparative advantages when you are talking about a green technology versus the old one. And I think steel's a really good example of that, right? The way that we do it at the moment is Australia digs up coal and we dig up iron ore and we send those to China, and China makes them into steel. And when you start thinking about replacing that coal, what you realise is it actually makes sense to do one step in that process here, which is turning the iron ore into iron and then shipping the iron to someone who can turn it into steel. And that requires not just a technological change, but it's also a political conversation, because it means you have to convince Korea or Japan or China that they should relocate a whole lot of jobs to Australia. And you know, that's not, you know, from their perspectives, they're not necessarily going to want to do that. And I mean, you sort of raised the thing around nickel as well, is that, you know, Australia is not the only person who's got minerals. A lot of other people have minerals. And how those deals shape up, you know, to do with the sort of the geopolitical relationship between countries, and also countries, you know, any democratic country, the politicians are going to want to protect their own people first, and we shouldn't really be surprised by that. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right to raise it, that it's a lot more complicated than just a technological change. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so maybe, and thanks Harry for the question, maybe two comments on that, picking up on my earlier comments. So the first is about the playing field and whether it's level or not. And clearly it isn't, and not just in the regional context, but at the global context. And on the global context, President Trump and what he's doing, he's resetting the global trading system. We spent a lot of time thinking about this. What he's also doing as part of that exercise is resetting the energy system by re-incentivizing fossil fuel production. And his basic aim is to drive others out of business. And this is why the Europeans are responding to that. And it's just a matter of time before those effects find their way into Australia and start to frame how we think about longer-term green transition policies. And certainly the Chinese are thinking very hard about this and responding to it, as are the Japanese and others. So the landscape is being rearranged in ways that we don't understand, and that will affect our green transition policies, which is not detract from anything in Alison's speech, because I thought it was a brilliant speech, but we're not an island that exists in isolation from what's going on in the global trading system. And it's serious, is basically the point I would make.
There's one last question. We're nearly at 6:30, so let's make it.
Thank you very much.
Chris
I enjoyed
Hodges.
all of the talks, thanks. My name's Rod Hill, former CSIRO, former Monash University. It's surprising if net zero is such an important issue for us all in Australia, why is it that the one card that's not on the table that every other continent in the globe has at their disposal other than Antarctica is a civil nuclear power industry? All of these other countries can't be wrong. Countries that have insulation rates similar to us, think of North Africa, Central China, etc. I just wonder, why hasn't anyone mentioned the word nuclear tonight?
Who wants to take that quickly?
Well, yeah, thanks, Rod. I mean, firstly, that's my comment about we need to be looking at outputs, not inputs. Obviously, for the Australian context, we currently have got legal barriers to that. And so, you know, my perspective is that we should be removing those barriers. obviously the nuclear question is a very challenging one, but yeah, certainly in Australia it's also been a political divide, which has been one of the things that Alison made. Obviously, as you're very aware of those points, that we need to, until the politicians can get past the political fighting over that topic, it remains a vexed issue. But my perspective is we should be technology agnostic, and we should put all options on the table.
Peter.
Yeah, so obviously you've gathered my accent is not Australian. So I've come from a country that's had nuclear power since I grew up, which is South Africa. It's just part of the energy mix, an accepted part of the energy mix, which I guess gets to community acceptance. So that's one big issue, clearly. I'm not sure the Australian community as a whole is ready to accept nuclear power yet, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't have the debate. But then the third issue is competitiveness, construction costs, and whether it's viable or not, and that gets to your output versus input debate. And I think we should be technology neutral, frankly, when it comes to these questions.
I think that's right, because the way that our electricity market is structured, nuclear would not be competitive in that market. And that's because it's quite an expensive technology, but it's one that likes to run all the time. And the way that our market is operating now is we need things that can turn on and off quickly and that can recover their capital quickly. And that's just to do with the economic structure of the way that we've decided to buy and sell energy. So we could take the ban away and we could do all of the work to put in place a regulatory regime to allow people to build a nuclear power station, because that's the other thing. It's not as simple as taking the ban off. You have to tell people what rules apply if they want to build one. And I don't think anyone would build one because they wouldn't be able to make any money out of it.
Thank you. Okay, I'm sorry, Greg, you're going to have to ask your question later. I'd like to particularly thank Alison. And Alison, this is thank you for your great effort in putting that wonderful talk together tonight. That is clearly not a bottle of wine, but I hope you'll take that that bag carrier to your Melbourne University campus whenever you need a drink. Now, tonight, our speakers are all highly acclaimed in their fields, as we've said, particularly relating to low carbon and climate mitigation, technology development, commercialisation, economics, biodiversity, public policy, and educating and empowering communities. So we've got a really good cross-disciplinary group here with Alison's oversight. I think the only thing we have to do now is all lift our game. We've all got to work harder. We know what the solutions are. We know the competitive outputs, Gus, not too prescriptive. We just got to get them happening. So I'd really like you all to put your hands together and thank our panel tonight.